Welcome to this module on learning strategy. Now, before we go any further, it's important to point out that learning strategy is a part of an overarching HR strategy. Learning strategy cannot exist in a vacuum, cannot exist on its own. It can't exist in a detached way. And it would be ridiculous to talk about how people learn if we didn't also consider how they get paid, how we communicate with them, how we decide what roles they have to fulfill, what processes they work to, how the organisation is structured around them. So it can't be talked about in a separate way from HR strategy. But in fact, learning strategy has a couple of very simple ideas that sit behind what it's trying to achieve. One is the organisation needs to learn better than its competitors. So in that way, it's the same as an HR strategy, in that it's all about competitive advantage. You have to learn more, quicker, faster, better than your competitors. The other key idea is that learning strategy links very much with organisation design, because what the learning strategist is trying to do is create an environment that enables, encourages, allows people to learn as much as they possibly can to help the organisation create as much value as possible. The key here is to have a strategy that is coherent. Now, the vast majority of organisations, in my experience, spend money on training and development, but very, very few of them have anything that you would call a learning strategy. Something else we're going to look at in some detail is the idea of a learning system. And a true learning professional should know what a learning system looks and feels like, and they should help their organisations to start installing just such a learning system. This is the learning strategy module. What we're going to cover here initially is looking at learning as part of a whole system. Then we'll move on to the question of how important learning is to innovation for organisations. This will be dependent on how mature they are in their understanding of how they become a learning organisation. We then go back in time to look at Kolb's learning experiential cycle of learning. We look at the complete learning framework, we consider a system for learning, and then we look at single and double loop learning, and finish off by considering what happens if you don't have any of these things in place. You start to produce a vicious circle of non-learning. This diagram is meant to look at organisations like we might look at an atom, and we're going to split the atom and see what component parts there are to the organisation. This should be a complete system. Everything should fit perfectly together. So let's have a look at this HR business strategy and see some of the component parts would be how the finances are managed in the organisation, so there may be a financial strategy, how well the organisation markets itself through a marketing strategy, whether it does any research of new products and new services, and certainly there needs now to be a specific conscious attempt to put together a human capital strategy. Now, if we go a bit deeper into this atom and look at another satellite within the whole system, we need this human capital strategy to be built up of other elements such as acquisition of talent, development of talent, performance management to make sure people who work in the organisation perform well. We also need to recognise and reward them and encourage them to perform as well as they can. And last but not least on this list is the organisation needs to be consciously always trying to learn. And this satellite feeds back to the other satellites by saying, are we learning as quickly as well as we need to? That is really what a learning strategy is all about. That is where it fits into the complete system, the complete picture. The diagram you've just seen might look very strange, but it is incredibly difficult to explain some of these concepts in diagrammatic terms, in pictures. It's difficult as well in words. So what we need to do is keep focused on what we're trying to achieve here. And one of the things that we're actually trying to achieve in learning, obviously, is innovation. Apart from learning how to do our basic tasks, keep the business in operation by learning how to produce things and give a service, We need to innovate. We only create more value by innovating, by coming up with new ways of doing things. And so we have to learn new ways of doing things. So learning strategy is almost synonymous with an innovation strategy. So let's look at innovation now in a little bit of detail. Obviously, the whole point of having a learning strategy is so that the organisation can learn how to improve. And if it wants to improve, it needs to innovate. So learning and innovation are almost synonymous. A lot of organisations try and innovate, and The Economist did a survey on how well they achieved this goal of innovation back in 1999, and there were some interesting lessons to learn from their survey. Here's one conclusion. Two things set apart all organisations with a record of innovation. One is they foster individuals who are internally driven. The second is they do not leave innovation to chance, they pursue it systematically. They actively search for change, the root of all innovation, then carefully evaluate its potential for an economic or social return. The Economist was absolutely clear that if you want innovation in organisations, it has to happen systematically. It doesn't happen by chance. More interestingly still, they say invariably breakthrough innovations require a fundamental rethink. Sometimes they come from dusting off ideas that failed to make it in the past. So if we're going to have a learning organisation that wants to innovate, part of this might involve going back to some very old ideas, and that's what we're going to do on the rest of this module. I think what the Economist survey is really telling us is that creating the environment for innovation is much more important than directly, consciously trying to innovate and trying to bring about new ideas. I quite like this conclusion. It sits very easily with me that innovation happens naturally a lot of the time. It has to be helped along with good systems, with a good environment, a good climate for people to feel comfortable coming up with ideas and trying new things out. But at the end of the day, human beings are very, very creative, and really what we're trying to do is unleash their natural talents, I think, in terms of innovation. So it still leaves us with this fundamental question in learning strategy, which is how do we create that environment where this is more likely to happen? This leads us on to a scale I developed some years ago called the Learning Maturity Scale, and if you've done the HR Strategy module, it is a parallel scale to the HR Strategy scale of maturity. We've already established that learning strategy is part of an HR or human capital strategy, which in turn is an integral part of an HR business strategy. Everything is entwined in one complete system. But any organisation that wants to continuously improve has to continuously learn. And this scale mirrors the HR maturity scale in the HR strategy module. So it has on one end of the scale a very reactive approach to training. This would often involve sending people on training courses without too much thought about what is expected of them afterwards. Some organisations are slightly more mature and see training development as an ongoing process, so we'll have things like performance development plans. Other organisations who are further up the scale know the difference between training and development, which are inputs, and learning, which is an output. And the best organisations understand that the only way to do this, to get the most out of everybody's potential, is to have the whole organisation learning. This is a whole system approach to the subject of learning. Now, along this scale, there are various stages of development or evolution. At stage 1, a very immature organisation doesn't use the word learning and actually just runs courses on an ad hoc basis, maybe has a menu of courses which people can choose from. It does whatever people want. It's all about keeping the cost down, so the average number of bums on seats is important in these immature organisations. At stage 2, they employ a professional person who knows that all training programs should at least have some training objectives. There should be a check on individual suitability for the training. There should be a basic training needs analysis. But they probably wouldn't have many systems in place because the organisation is not mature enough to know that it's systems that make a real difference in learning. Nevertheless, organisations evolve, And some get to stage 3, where they start to have effective training management from effective training managers. These are people whose expertise is valued, who start to put a basic training system in place that says some people can go on one type of training and other people can't. They start to distinguish between some candidates being suitable for certain development and others who aren't suitable for it. So it's a discriminating approach to training and development, and it moves away from sending everybody on courses. In the middle of this scale there is a thing called the evaluation hurdle. This basically says that up until this point the input model of training and development has not been measured in terms of its outputs, and this is an education that both training departments, employees and executive teams have to go through to understand that training and development cannot just have money thrown at it if the organisation wants to get some return on that money. It has to move to a much more sophisticated approach which accepts that learning is the name of the game, and so it needs in place a stage 4 type business person who works in human resource development. We might call them business partners or learning and development business partners, and they will make sure there's an evaluation system in place, and all learning goes through this system to check that what people are trying to learn is actually aligned with what the organisation needs to know. These people will not be servants to line managers because they understand the business and they're treated as equal partners, and they'll be saying to line managers that they need to do more themselves to develop their staff. This is a much more mature organisation from a learning perspective. Over time the organisation moves through a transitional period where it stops looking at just operational needs and thinks about the future. It knows it needs to have a learning system in place. Courses will be very limited, maybe especially limited to technical courses, and managers will have started to develop themselves as coaches with the help from the learning and development team probably. Stage 6 is the last stage on this scale. Although this scale has no actual end, it goes on forever because learning is always a continuous process. The organisation now as a whole is so mature that everybody in the organisation shares their knowledge. There is a culture of wanting and willingness to share knowledge, and this means that anybody who's got any intellectual capital will find there is an opportunity to use that at work, and if they want to learn, then any support to their learning will be individually centred. So ideas like e-learning will become very, very flexible and adaptable to individual needs. This is the complete maturity scale, and it will only be put in place if it's part of a learning strategy. One reason I use the learner maturity scale is to help learning professionals have useful dialogues with their executive and with their managers and with their employees generally about what learning really means and how the different perspectives of what learning means can get in the way of the organisation learning. And key to this maturity scale is that barrier, that wall, which is based on the idea that organisations don't really understand where evaluation fits in to the complete picture. Evaluation really serves two purposes. One, it asks the question before learning takes place, why do we need to learn this? What's the potential value of it? And it also afterwards says, did we learn what we need to know? And if we didn't, should we go back to the beginning and start again? So evaluation plays a key part in the maturity scale. And if you haven't done the evaluation and ROI module, then perhaps now is the time to do it. The other key function of evaluation is to create a closed loop learning cycle. Now, somebody who came up with the theory of closed loop learning cycles many years ago is Kolb. So we're going to have a look at Kolb's views on how we learn from experience. A lot of organisations seem to overcomplicate the whole subject of learning, so let's go back to some basic principles here. And what better place to start than in Kolb's learning cycle? Basically, Kolb said we learn from our experiences. Let's look at this in a little more detail. The cycle normally starts with a plan, and the plan is based on our previous experience. Imagine if you'd never been to a game of football before, but you planned based on your experience of hearing friends saying it was a great game to watch. You then join them at a football match and have an experience alongside them. And you notice that the happiest friends are the ones who are supporting the side that are winning. So you review that experience and you say, well, if I'm going to carry on watching football, if I really want to enjoy it, I need to support a team that wins more often than not. And you conclude from that experience that you better find out which are the best teams. So you go and look at the league table and find out who wins more often. And then your next plan is to go and see a team that wins more often. This is such an obvious thing to say. This is how every human being learns. And experience is what drives our learning. So what we need to do in terms of learning strategies, not overcomplicate the issue, but actually just make sure that people have positive experiences and then plan to improve. And improvement can only mean improving what the organisation is actually trying to achieve. I don't know what lessons you've learned from Kolb's model, but the key lesson for me is we want to get an iterative cycle going, a very natural one that's based on people's experiences. So if you ask an employee or a manager at any level to try something out for the first time, to try a new idea out, they are going to experience what this new idea feels like. And their first experience might be a bad experience. They might try out something like Six Sigma and not like it at all. Perhaps they were never very good at maths or whatever, didn't understand statistics, and so they didn't have a good experience. So maybe they wouldn't try it again. So it's a very personal thing, Kolb Cycle. And unless we really understand that, we're not going to get the individuals to want to learn and to learn. And so also we're not going to get the organisation to learn. If we can't get individuals to learn, we can't get the organisation to learn. It's as simple as that. So now we need to move on to this whole idea of cycles of learning and really move this up a level now to the whole organisation getting into a cycle, a positive reinforcing cycle of learning. But not just learning for the sake of it. The idea of lifelong learning to me is a meaningless concept. What does it mean? Lifelong learning for any organisation should mean that people in the organisation are learning how to not only achieve the strategic objectives of the organisation, but how to constantly move the organisation forward in the right direction. Now, just before we leave Kolb, if you've already done the professional toolkit module, you will see that Kolb's idea of experiential learning and Deming's idea of the plan, do, check, act cycle are in effect the same idea. And if you put those two ideas together, you have a really, really powerful learning and innovation model that is directly linked to operational measures of business performance. So we're going to look at a framework that enables us to do this. It's worth just mentioning that the framework we're going to look at now from a learning perspective is exactly the same as the strategic framework in the business partnering and consulting module, which we looked at from an HR angle. But they are the same framework in effect. That's how integrated this whole series is. If you've already done the business partnering consulting module, you will have seen a very similar diagram to this already, but one that was based on what HR needs to do to ensure that the business plans and strategy are achieved through people interventions. This is exactly the same diagram, but now applied specifically to training, development and learning. And in essence, the way to link how we learn to the way the organisation needs to improve is done through asking some critical questions. These critical questions are meant to produce a training or learning needs analysis that says, what do we need to learn to help achieve our operating and business plans? It then goes round the cycle of designing interventions, delivering, reinforcing good learning. This would often be through first-line supervisors or managers, who then ensure that the new skills, the new knowledge are transferred to the workplace, and the feedback loop is closed by asking the question through evaluation, did it work or not? But true evaluation actually feeds back to the organisation as a whole and says it did work or it didn't, so that any mistakes made can be rectified. This is a complete training learning cycle as part of a learning strategy that is part of a whole system approach to organisational management. And there is an exercise on this, but you might also like to look at the evaluation module because evaluation is key to making this learning cycle work in practice. Like many of the models and tools in this whole series, this framework does make sense, on paper anyway. But really what matters is how you make it a reality, how you put it into practice. And you can't put this framework into practice unless you are creating at the same time a learning system. You're creating the environment for the framework to work. Now, just using the language of learning system won't mean much to a lot of senior managers that you have to deal with. They'll think you're talking a different language. So let's look at this whole question of system and learning system in very simple terms that you could explain to anybody. Whatever we've learnt on this module so far, it can sound either very mechanistic, putting frameworks in place, or it can sound too complicated. So let's keep it simple, but at the same time, let's do something quite sophisticated. Let's try and create a human learning system. Now, if you don't really understand what systems are all about, then consider this traffic light. Is this a system? Well, actually, a single traffic light on its own is not much use, because normally you need a pair of them, because the whole point of traffic lights is to control traffic moving at least in two directions. And also the mechanics of the system are important, the red light and green lights and the sequence, but they aren't the things that really govern this system. What really governs a traffic light system are human beings with our principles and our values and our beliefs that we should stop at a red light and go only when it's on green. Because if we don't, we are doing something out of keeping with the rest of society. So it's human values that really drive systems, that make them human systems. People who don't share the values will always try and bypass the system. They will jump the lights, or they'll go too early. So human systems is what we really need for a learning system. And this is quite sophisticated. And if we don't get it right, then we will not get all the benefits of what a learning system can bring. So there's a very simple lesson from the last slide showing some simple traffic lights, which is any mechanical system is nothing without the human system to support it. It's our values, our principles, what we really believe in that makes these systems work in practice. So let's pull some of these ideas together now. If you want to ensure that people learn, that their values are such that they want to learn, their values are such that they believe the organisation is doing a useful job, something they want to support. If we try and pull all this together, then what we're trying to create is a system and an environment where the people in the organisation are using all of their brain power and all of their motivation to learn how to help the organisation improve. Now that sounds all very good, doesn't it, in theory? But what tools can we use to make this happen in practice? Now there's one academic, Chris Argyris, who's been around for a long time, who came up with a notion of single and double loop learning. So we're going to look, this is a very important piece of theory, but it's also very important in practice. Chris Argyris, who's written many times on the subject of organisational learning, came up with the idea of a distinction between single and double loop learning. His simple example was to think of a thermostat controlling the temperature in a room. This only works on one variable, heat. It either switches on or off according to the temperature in the room. That's a single way of thinking. It only looks at one variable. Double loop learning looks at all the potential variables involved in a process or a problem. Now here's an example of what this means in practice for organisations. A very simple example. A single loop approach to a problem here is if the photocopier stops working and you think it's because the paper mechanism is jamming, then you would fix the paper feed mechanism. And if it kept breaking down, maybe this would be your first choice every time. This is single loop. It tends to go round and round again, just looking at the same problem from the same angle. Double loop learning looks at all the possible causes of the problem. So the photocopier was not working properly, and it's the paper that keeps jamming. But you check the mechanism, and you also find out the paper's damp because it's stored in the wrong place. And the maintenance schedule needs to change because it should have been checked sooner. And some people are not properly trained to use it, and so on. Now, this is as much an attitude as a technique. So what we actually want to create to produce a learning system is an attitude amongst all employees that this is how they go about dealing with issues and problems, that they look at all the causes before they start jumping to any conclusions. And on the next slide, we'll see what happens when organisations get stuck in single loop mode. If you understand now the difference between single and double loop, and you have an understanding that this is as much about human beings either wanting or not wanting to learn, then you can see how important a subject this is. But if you really haven't got the gist of this subject, then I'd like to show you one more slide of a story. Actually, it's a true story of me going into a do-it-yourself retailer wanting to buy a light fitting. And just let's have a look and see how this organisation responded to a customer bringing a piece of equipment back. Here is a simple example of a single loop which goes around and around on itself, otherwise known as a non-learning loop, and what we would always call a vicious circle, going round and round in circles. So imagine that you buy something from a shop and you take it back because there's something wrong with it, it's defective. So here a customer returns an incorrect light fitting. The person on the customer service desk says, yeah, sure, we'll swap it. Would you like to go and choose another one? And you say, okay, I'll go and choose another one. You choose another fitting, only to find that the same problem with the first one is in the second one as well. So you go back to the customer service desk, and the customer service desk says, yeah, sure, we'll swap that. Why don't you go and get another one? It doesn't take long to see that this is going to go round in circles until all the fittings on the shelves have been removed. A double loop approach to this problem would say right from the outset, oh, I wonder what is causing this fitting to be wrong, and I wonder what it means for the organisation as a whole. A learning system in place would mean that everybody involved in the process of specifying, purchasing, putting on the shelves this particular fitting would be involved in learning how to make sure it doesn't happen again. So organisations that are stuck in non-learning loops are eventually going to go out of business. I think at the end of this module you have a very simple question to answer if you want to regard yourself as a true learning professional. What advice would you give to the company that we've just talked about, where the very pleasant girl behind the desk was quite happy to help as much as possible, but there was no evidence really that she was doing everything she could to make sure the best was brought out of that situation? What advice would you give to that company? Well, I think what you could do is look at the complete system. So who is specifying the product? What sort of goods inwards checking system is in place? What happens if there is a complaint? Who deals with that complaint? Who's responsible for it? What process is in place to check the complaint? How do you communicate back to the manufacturers that there is a problem? How do you communicate to your own purchasing department on what they're purchasing and what checks they have in place? Now, as an organisation moves to greater and greater maturity, it will plug all these holes, plug all these gaps. But not only that, it will learn from their experiences and will capture that learning. That's what a true learning organisation is all about. And if you want your organisation to be a true learning organisation, I think it needs true learning professionals.